You call it ambition, but is it? What if your hunger for power isn't coming from purpose, but panic? What if you're chasing control, not because you're strong, but because you're scared to feel weak? Machiavelli saw this centuries ago. He warned not all leaders rise from vision. Some rise because they're too anxious to be still. In this video, we explore a powerful psychological truth hidden in Machiavelli's political thinking. He wasn't just advising princes on how to rule. He was diagnosing the emotional traps of those who seek power. He knew there's a sharp difference between ambition, the calm, strategic pursuit of purpose, and anxiety, the restless urge to dominate because you're afraid to be dominated. We'll uncover how Machiavelli's insights can help you reflect deeply on your own motivations, spot the silent signs of anxiety in leadership, and pursue influence without losing inner peace. This isn't just about power, it's about you. When we think of power, we often divide it into two categories: good or bad, moral or immoral, just or unjust. But Machiavelli invites us to see power differently, not as a moral category, but as a force like fire or electricity. His perspective is not shaped by idealism, but by realism, even brutal honesty. In The Prince, power is not judged by virtue or vice. It is judged by results, by consequences, and most importantly, by clarity of intention. Machiavelli's most fundamental idea is this: power is never neutral, and your relationship with it reveals who you truly are. To him, power is not something that automatically corrupts. Rather, it reveals the underlying psychology of the person who holds or seeks it. If you are clear-minded, self-aware, and grounded, power can be a tool for transformation. But if you are confused, insecure, or anxious, that same power becomes volatile. It exaggerates your fears, exposes your weaknesses, and magnifies your inner chaos. This is where Machiavelli becomes more of a psychologist than a strategist. He writes, "It ought to be remembered that there is nothing more difficult to take in hand, more perilous to conduct, or more uncertain in its success, than to take the lead in the introduction of a new order of things." In other words, power is difficult not just because of enemies or politics. It's difficult because of what it demands from within. It tests your ability to stay stable in the face of threat, betrayal, and temptation. Now, here's the critical distinction Machiavelli forces us to consider. Are you pursuing power from a place of stability, or from a place of anxiety? He doesn't explicitly use the word anxiety in the modern psychological sense, but it's embedded in his descriptions of princes who befall from grace. He describes leaders who become paranoid, who cannot tolerate dissent, who demand obedience because they cannot command respect. These are rulers who confuse control with security. They are not truly ambitious. They are anxious. To Machiavelli, genuine ambition is disciplined. It is aware of risk. It is strategic in silence. It knows when to act and when to wait. It is not rushed by emotion, but guided by necessity. Anxiety, on the other hand, is reactive. It pushes people to seize power not to achieve something meaningful, but simply to escape a feeling of vulnerability. Anxious leaders often overreact to minor threats, surround themselves with flatterers instead of challengers, interpret disagreement as betrayal, resort to force when they feel unseen or insecure. This is why Machiavelli's work remains relevant today. Not just in politics, but in business, in relationships, even in our personal goals. Whenever you find yourself obsessing over control, image, or dominance, you must ask, is this truly ambition, or is this fear disguising itself as leadership? One of the clearest signs of anxious power seeking is the inability to be still. Machiavelli's ideal ruler knows when to pause, when to listen, and when to strike with precision. The anxious one, by contrast, is always moving, not because they have a plan, but because they are terrified of what might happen if they stop. To Machiavelli, the most dangerous prince is not the ruthless one, it is the one who doesn't know himself. And that's why power in his eyes is never neutral. It is always revealing. It either sharpens your clarity or amplifies your confusion. It is never silent. It always speaks, and what it says depends entirely on who you are when you hold it. Ambition and anxiety, two forces that can drive individuals to seek power, to rise, to dominate. But while they may appear similar on the surface, Machiavelli forces us to pause and examine the stark difference beneath. His political philosophy helps us see that the emotional origin of your actions matters just as much as the outcome. Both the ambitious and the anxious work long hours. Both take risks. Both may lead nations, organizations, or movements. But one does so with vision, the other with fear. And sooner or later, that difference reveals itself in action, judgment, and ultimately, in legacy. Let's first understand ambition through Machiavelli's eyes. For Machiavelli, ambition was not evil. In fact, he saw it as necessary. A leader must want to rise, must desire impact, must be willing to challenge the existing order. The prince must aspire to command, to govern, to leave a mark, but this kind of ambition is not reckless. It is calculated. It is guided by a cool mind, not a restless heart. This form of ambition is strategic. It sees the long game, not just the next battle. Composed. It can wait, endure pressure, and even tolerate being misunderstood. Detached from vanity, it seeks power for its utility, not for applause. Now compare this to anxiety, which Machiavelli does not name directly, but implies constantly in his warnings against insecure rulers. Anxiety-driven action is impulsive. It is the prince who fears losing favor, who sees enemies in shadows, who surrounds himself with yes-men, who punishes before understanding. The anxious leader is not pursuing a vision. He's running from a feeling. Anxiety masquerades as ambition, but it leaves behind a different pattern's eye. Reaction over reflection. Control over collaboration. Urgency over patience. Such leaders don't desire power to lead, they desire it to feel safe. Machiavelli repeatedly emphasizes that leadership demands psychological resilience. He writes about princes who fall, not because they lacked opportunity, but because they couldn't manage their own impulses. A prince who lacks self-control will overextend, lash out at critics, or become paralyzed by doubt. Their downfall, Machiavelli hints, often begins not on the battlefield, but in their minds. Let's translate this to modern life. How often do we mistake our restlessness for drive? How often do we set goals, not because we believe in them, but because we fear being left behind, or judged as unimportant, or seen as ordinary? Machiavelli would ask, do you want to win, or are you just afraid to lose? Do you truly desire impact, or are you just afraid of being forgotten? The emotional fuel behind your actions matters. An anxious person may climb quickly, but they cannot stay grounded, because their need for validation, control, or certainty will sabotage the very thing they built. This is why Machiavelli respected calm, strategic, and sometimes even ruthless ambition, because it was stable. It wasn't flailing. It wasn't seeking love from power. It was using power for purpose. Ultimately, ambition creates leaders. Anxiety creates tyrants. One builds carefully, knowing the cost of each move. The other grabs blindly, terrified of falling. One is feared by design. The other is feared by accident, because fear is all they know. The emotional split matters. Not because Machiavelli wanted us to be moral saints, but because he knew that unclear motives make for unstable leadership. And unstable leadership, whether in a palace or a household, always ends in collapse. So when you feel the drive to succeed, to influence, to lead, pause and ask yourself, is this ambition, or is this anxiety wearing ambition's clothes? Machiavelli knew the difference, and he warned us to learn it, before power teaches it the hard way. Machiavelli admired cunning. He admired courage, strategy, and a mind that could read the tides of fortune. But what he never admired, and frequently warned against, was emotional instability in leadership. To him, One of the surest paths to ruin was not a lack of strength, but a lack of psychological balance. Let's turn theory into reality. What happens when a leader's quest for power is driven by anxiety rather than ambition? What patterns emerge? And how did Machiavelli distinguish between the two? The best place to start is with the man Machiavelli famously admired, Caesar Borgia. Machiavelli regarded Borgia as the prototype of an ideal prince, not because he was perfect, far from it, but because he exemplified the rare quality of strategic calm under pressure. When Borgia took power in Romagna, a notoriously lawless region, he acted with calculated force. He installed a brutal enforcer, Ramiro di Orco, to bring swift order. But once peace was restored, Borgia had Orco executed, publicly, to gain the people's trust and to show that cruelty, while sometimes necessary, must be controlled. That wasn't just politics. It was psychological precision. Borgia's ambition was not fueled by panic. He did not lash out randomly. He didn't crave control because he feared others. He used control as a tool, not as a shield. Now contrast that with rulers, both ancient and modern, who appear powerful on the outside but are consumed by inner anxiety. Take King Saul from the Hebrew Bible, a classic case of anxious power. Chosen as the first king of Israel, Saul begins with promise, but soon he becomes paranoid. He cannot bear the popularity of David. He misinterprets loyalty as threat. He breaks laws, consults witches, and eventually dies in disgrace. His undoing wasn't lack of intelligence, it was unchecked fear. Or consider Emperor Nero of Rome, who ruled with insecurity disguised as dominance. He silenced critics with violence, eliminated family members, and obsessed over his image as an artist and ruler. He wielded absolute power, but it couldn't silence his anxiety, only feed it. His reign ended in chaos and suicide. Even in the modern age, this pattern repeats. A corporate CEO might build an empire only to crumble under the weight of control issues and ego. A political leader might start with noble intentions but slowly become obsessed with approval ratings, media narratives, or imagined enemies. Instead of leading with clarity, they govern with suspicion, constantly reacting rather than reflecting. Why does this matter? Because Machiavelli wasn't writing for tyrants. He was writing for anyone who wanted to understand the psychology of leadership. His case studies, whether explicit or implied, reveal a timeless lesson: power amplifies who you already are. If you are secure and clear in your purpose, power enhances your impact. If you are anxious and uncertain, power becomes dangerous, not just to others, but to yourself. This is why some leaders inspire calm and loyalty, while others provoke fear and resistance. The anxious leader interprets every challenge as betrayal. They attack not out of strength, but out of desperation. Their grip on power becomes tighter, and in doing so, more fragile. Machiavelli teaches us that true leadership is less about how much power you hold, and more about how well you hold yourself while holding it. Caesar Borgia rose swiftly because he planned, waited, struck decisively, and knew when to retreat. Those ruled by anxiety cannot retreat, cannot breathe, cannot think. They are prisoners of the very throne they sit upon. So the question is not just, are you in control? The real question Machiavelli forces us to ask is, are you in control? Or are you just afraid of losing it? The answer will determine how long your power lasts, and whether it elevates or destroys you. One of the most profound and most overlooked lessons in Machiavelli's political philosophy is this: constant action is not a sign of strength. In fact, it can be the exact opposite, a mask worn by leaders who are unsure, anxious, or afraid to be perceived as passive. Machiavelli understood that in the theater of power, mastery often looks like silence. It looks like waiting, and sometimes it looks like doing nothing at all. In The Prince, Machiavelli does not instruct leaders to be hyperactive. He instructs them to be watchful, observant, patient, calculated. He draws attention to the value of timing, not just action, as a key quality of a successful ruler. A leader who strikes too soon or too often reveals their desperation, not their dominance. This is a warning that transcends time. Motion is not mastery. Activity is not authority. Many of the leaders Machiavelli observed failed not because they lacked power, but because they misused energy. They mistook urgency for necessity. They equated momentum with control. But in reality, they were just reacting, not leading. We live in a world that praises hustle, noise, and visibility. The modern age rewards constant engagement, rapid decisions, public declarations. And yet, history consistently shows us that the most powerful people are not always the loudest. They are often the most composed. Let's take an example. Machiavelli might have appreciated the difference between strategic patience and reactive leadership. A reactive leader is always speaking, always acting, always chasing. They are driven by a need to stay ahead, not because the situation demands it, but because their ego does. They fear stillness, they fear being misunderstood or worse, being ignored. So they keep moving, not towards something meaningful, but away from something uncomfortable. Strategic leaders, by contrast, are not obsessed with visibility. They are not afraid to wait. In fact, they know that waiting can be a form of power. They understand that sometimes the battlefield must settle before the sword is drawn. That hesitation is not always weakness. It is often wisdom. Machiavelli knew that control was not about constant interference. It was about timing. In The Prince, he repeatedly emphasizes the idea of fortuna, fortune, or fate, and how a great leader must learn to adjust their style depending on the circumstances. Sometimes you act like a lion, sometimes like a fox. But in either case, it's not movement that matters. It's mastery over movement. This is especially true in today's fast-paced environments, politics, business, social platforms. Many leaders and influencers confuse being active with being effective. They post constantly, respond impulsively, pivot hastily, and they burn out. Or worse, they overexpose themselves and lose the mystique and credibility that true leadership requires. Machiavelli would caution, don't rush to act simply because silence is uncomfortable. Let silence serve you. Let patience mature your judgment. Leadership is often about what you withhold, not what you reveal. The wise leader resists the temptation to speak first, to act rashly, or to prove themselves. They understand that not every challenge demands a response. Not every problem is urgent. Not every critic deserves attention. In Machiavelli's worldview, mastery is restraint, and restraint is only possible when you are not being led by anxiety. The anxious leader acts out of fear of being seen as weak, of losing relevance, of falling behind, so they move, always, endlessly. But that movement is not progress, it is noise. The master, on the other hand, moves with intent. They do not fear stillness, because they are not trying to prove power, they are preparing to use it. So when you find yourself rushing to react, remind yourself of Machiavelli's silent warning, a wise prince waits. A desperate one runs. Which one are you becoming? Machiavelli's political insights were never meant only for kings and princes. They were, and still are, a mirror for anyone who seeks influence, leadership, or growth. But that mirror is sharp. It doesn't flatter. It reveals. It forces us to ask the most uncomfortable question. Why do I want power? This keynote takes a personal turn. After understanding the difference between ambition and anxiety in others, Machiavelli's real challenge is this: can you tell the difference within yourself? On the surface, both ambition and anxiety may look the same: drive, discipline, urgency, even success. But beneath, their emotional textures are completely different. And if you can't tell which one is driving you, you may end up achieving something that ultimately destroys your peace. Let's begin with a few self-inventory questions. These are not based on Machiavelli's words directly, but they're deeply inspired by his way of thinking. Brutally honest, psychologically exact. Self-reflection high 1. Would I still pursue this if no one applauded? Ambition seeks achievement because it is purposeful. It desires impact, not necessarily recognition. It can work in silence. It doesn't collapse when praise is missing. Anxiety, however, often disguises itself as ambition. It seeks visibility. It feeds off approval. It needs the applause, the attention, the validation, because without it, the person feels invisible, and invisibility feels like failure. If your drive disappears in the absence of recognition, what you're chasing may not be growth. It may be reassurance. Self-reflection 8.2y. Do I act out of clarity or urgency? Machiavelli admired bold action, but he feared compulsive action. He warned against princes who reacted to every threat, every rumor, every challenge. Ask yourself, are you making decisions calmly from a place of long-term vision? Or are you always reacting, fixing, pivoting, explaining, just to keep up? Ambition makes room for pauses. It understands timing. It trusts the plan. Anxiety cannot sit still. It demands constant movement, often without direction. Self-reflection 3. Is my need to lead rooted in vision, or in fear of being powerless? This is the most difficult and perhaps the most revealing question. Machiavelli believed that many rulers rise not from strength, but from insecurity. They chase power not because they know what to do with it, but because they're terrified of what might happen if they don't have it. True ambition arises from a desire to build, to change, to shape. It is future-oriented. It thrives even in uncertainty. But anxiety-based ambition is reactive. It tries to outrun doubt. It fears losing control. It leads not with ideas, but with defensiveness. Ask yourself, am I creating a vision or protecting an identity? Am I leading others or just afraid of being led? Key lesson from Machiavelli. For Machiavelli, leadership was not about perfection. It was about self-awareness. The prince who knows himself can bend fortune to his will. The one who doesn't will eventually be ruled by fear and call it fate. He did not moralize. He did not ask whether your ambition was good, but he asked, implicitly, is it stable? Is it sustainable? Is it strategic? That stability only comes when you know the engine behind your drive. Otherwise, you'll chase achievement endlessly, win battles that don't matter, and build castles on sand, all while convincing yourself that you're being noble. Final reflection. So, how do you know the difference in yourself? You slow down, you question your impulses, you track your patterns, and you dare to sit in silence, to see what arises when there's nothing to chase. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is stop moving, and in that stillness, you'll find your answer. Is this ambition, or is it anxiety in disguise?